Hello, kind people. This is Peter Svidler with the penultimate recap from the Tata Steel Wijk tournament 2019. Round 12 promised a lot of action. With 2 rounds to go, Magnus Carlsen and Anish Giri led the tournament on 7.5 out of 11, with Yanni Pomnishi only half a point behind. And with 2 rounds to go, obviously anything could happen. Today's round featured a lot of excitement, decisive games of all kinds, but the game of the day was a reasonably easy choice. We will be looking at the game Magnus Carlsen played with the white pieces against Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the young Polish player. They, in December, had an absolutely thrilling race for the World Championship title in the World Blitz in St. Petersburg, where Magnus scored an unbelievable amount of points and still only beat Duda by half a point when all was said and done. So that was their latest memory of each other, so to speak. And obviously the tournament situation made that game doubly important. So let's have a look at what happened there. Magnus opened with 1d4, and Duda played the Vienna, which he already played once at least in this tournament. And importantly, it's also an opening that Fabiano Caruana plays reasonably regularly, which means that Magnus probably was not entirely unprepared for this eventuality. And he goes e4, bishop b4, bishop takes c4, knight takes e4, and castle's short. And Jan Gustafsson, my partner during the live broadcasts, knows a lot more about these positions than I do. But I will try to explain slightly what's happening here. The choice basically is between a knight c3, bc, and here both bishop d6, a move which actually was discussed a decent amount in the challengers section this year in Wijk. And bishop e7, both are playable, and white gets just long-term compensation aimed at playing against the black king side, which looks a bit abandoned. White has plans of like knight e5 followed by queen g4, bishop often comes back to d3, rooks have decent half-open files. White has a lot of long-term initiative for the pawn, but black obviously has an extra pawn for and a very stable structure, which is quite important. So if he manages to weather the storm, he'll be okay. And there's also the move knight f6, which is, I think, the more popular choice right now, and also something that Caruana himself played in the Norway chess tournament in 2018 against Levon Aronian. Queen a4 check, knight c6. Early in the tournament, Shahryar Mamedov played bishop g5, I believe, in this position, and did not really get very far. But Magnus goes for sort of the main line, knight e5, obviously threatening the bishop on b4 after the trade. Duda plays rook b8. This is the main move in this position, and also the one made by Fabiano Caruana in that game against Levon. And Levon played d5 here, e d5, knight d5, knight d5, knight c6, a cute little tactical operation which wins the pawn back. But the resulting endgame was always going to be extremely unlikely to be much better for white, and Fabiano just held it without any issues whatsoever. It wasn't even remotely close. Instead of all that, Magnus blitzes out rook d1, which is a novelty, but this line is generally, this position, I guess, is a very typical example of modern theory, so to speak, where a lot of the people who play the Vienna with either white or black will have copious analysis of this position. But it has only been actually played in actual practice twice so far. So I think rook d1 probably features in many people's thoughts and maybe even detailed analysis, but there's no games and no mention of the move until today. Duda went into the tank here, understandably, when faced with a serious new idea in the opening, and eventually castled, which is by far the most natural move. Bishop d7 here, trying to maybe improve on the positions you'll see in the game, is really not very good at all because of knight d7, knight d7, d5, knight b6, and queen c2. And it turns out that these types of positions after knight takes c4 and dc6 are incredibly dangerous for black because it's just very difficult for black to establish proper coordination between his pieces. So bishop d7 is really not very good at all. Bishop d6, on the other hand, a strange move, once again postponing castles for one more tempo, but hoping to improve your fortunes if white does exactly what he did in the game. And the improvement here is in the fact that black is threatening at least an immediate draw with the chase of the queen on a7. And you cannot really play queen a4 because now there is a move rook b4 here, which wasn't available to black earlier. So after bishop d6, white has a choice between playing bishop g5 and going for some kind of long-term initiative, or taking on c6 and taking on c6 again with the queen. And black plays something along the lines of queen d7, let's say queen f3, bishop b7, queen h3, and black castles short. And the machine suggests this is slightly better for white, but it's definitely playable for black. I don't think this position is particularly horrible. But neither is the position Duda got in the game particularly horrible. He just castled, white took on c6 and took on a7 here, bishop d7, and queen a4. And this, as I mentioned, is the major difference between bishop d6 and castles, because now the queen manages to get to c2 here. c5, queen c2, black manages to trade off his double pawn on c6 for the central pawn on d4. But white obviously has quite clear trumps here, in particular a very simple plan of just shoving the a-pawn up the board and creating issues for black this way. This is not very easy to play for black at all, and the moves you should probably be making here are either queen e7, with the intention of playing bishop c6 as early as possible, or maybe bishop d6, with sort of similar ideas of playing bishop c6 later. And here white has a choice. You can actually still play rook h4, which is what happened in the game after Duda played bishop c5, but bishop c5 really is an invitation to play rook h4, considering the fact that even after bishop d6, when nothing is hanging, this move still makes a decent amount of sense. And here black probably needs to play something like rook e8 to prepare h6, and after something like a4, h6, bishop d2, knight d5, rook h3, the rook looks a bit silly on h3, but it did make black spend some tempi on things he would maybe normally not play, and the machine says white is slightly better. And the reason you maybe want to consider playing rook h4 here is that if you play the more obvious move a4, you do allow black this tactic of bishop takes a4, rook a4, bishop h2, king h2, and queen takes d4, where it feels to me that black has, I think, decent chances of holding this, although these positions, despite black having achieved what is supposed to be material equality, are not at all an obvious hold for black. Instead, Duda played bishop c5, as I mentioned, white played rook h4, and here Duda made a very uncharacteristic for a young, sharp, dynamic player mistake. He played h6 here, kind of completely disregarding the previous play from white. Instead, black should play rook e8, a4, and now h6. And here, I think the bishop just should be placed on d6 compared to the previous lines. The bishop is somewhat misplaced on c5, and white can play something like a5. But black might try to use the fact that the bishop is on c5 and not d6 by playing knight d5, rook h3, and bishop d4. Let's say a6, c5. And this is a really messy position, which I think is once again not that bad for black. The pawn on a6 is quite dangerous, but black has this very nice feast of pieces in the center, and the bishop will come to c6 later. And the rook on h3, as I mentioned, looks a bit silly. So a sharp position with very unclear outcomes. But h6 is just a flat-out mistake. I think, and as I said, this is such a typical idea that we started talking about it in the studio the moment the rook appeared on h4. That white, and I was even arguing that, let's say after bishop c5, rook h4, bishop c6, white can maybe even think about doing this here. bishop g5, h6, and take on h6 and queen c1. I'm pretty sure that with the bishop on c6 this doesn't work, but to me it seemed like it was very clear that this exact sequence was what white was aiming for. And h6 shows very poor awareness, I think, by Jan-Krzysztof of typical ideas in these structures. And of course Magnus, after some thinking, which I think mainly was dedicated to the question, why is he doing this, isn't he completely lost, took on h6 and played queen d2. And Jan-Krzysztof found the only way not to immediately resign here. The position is incredibly bad. We thought maybe playing knight e4, forcing white to take with the rook and distracting the rook from the h6 pawn, and playing bishop c6 might be half okay. But the machine says queen h6, bishop e4, knight e4, bishop e7. We sort of stopped the variation here, saying queen comes to d4. This is very unclear. As a matter of fact, it's completely winning for white because there's just nothing that can properly stop the idea of rook e1, e3, g3. Rook takes b2, white just goes h4. Next move rook e3, and then there's basically mate. Machine says black is completely helpless here. So knight h7, which is what Duda played, is strictly the only move here to continue the game. But somewhat surprisingly, the game actually is still sort of within the bounds of black drawing. I don't think anyone can call this equal, but I think with precise play, black in many cases will get very, very close to a draw. Maybe we'll actually draw the game. White has to take on h6, and now bishop takes f2, king takes f2, only move, queen f6 check. Queen takes f6 is a lot more logical than king g1 and rook takes b2. Even though the machine says white is better even here, starts pushing the a pawn, for instance, but I think most people would take on f6 and then play rook f1 with a tempo. And here black has two options which I think objectively should be stronger than what Duda played. Knight e8 is, my current thinking, is not the best because white goes rook f3. The threat is quite simply rook g3 and rook h4. Black plays f5 to stop rook g4. We give this check, and now we make a very strong move knight e2, creating quite simply an unstoppable threat of knight h4. I mean, not unstoppable, but very strong threat of knight f4, knight h5. The only move not to resign on the spot is rook c2, just hard stopping the move knight f4. But white plays king f2, and the threat now, if black does nothing, is to play bishop b3, drive the rook back to b2, and then play king e1. And then knight f4 really will be almost impossible to stop. So black needs to play f4 here, rook c3, takes, and my feeling is here the pawn on f4 is probably doomed. It will get picked up very early on, and the resulting positions have to be much closer to a white victory than to a draw. But the move which I suspect might be holding long term, although I did not have neither time nor energy, frankly, to check it properly, is knight h7, rook f3, and now simply bishop c6, rook g3 check, king h8. Once again, using the fact that there is rook takes g2 to stop rook h3, because rook h3, black has the obvious rook g2, rook g7. So white plays in some order the moves bishop f1, rook g8, we take on g8 and we go a4. a4 is a very useful move, not just because we're pushing the pawn, but because we will be playing rook c4 next move, and we need to stop rook b6 from being a good move at all. And here black, I think, should just completely forget about the cc7 pawn, and go knight f6, rook c4, bishop b7. White can even wait for one more move, go a5, knight g5, takes, rook a2, let's say a6, and we go king g7. And as I said, there's really no way for me to check this properly because it's a complicated endgame which would require a lot of computing power and brain power, which I also don't particularly have anymore, to evaluate. But my experience says that these two pieces do such a good job of controlling this pawn and never letting it progress further than a7. And black has decent counterplay, just pushing his stuff forward once he consolidates. That I have a feeling this probably is holdable for black, although once again, can't prove it and not a hill I'm prepared to die on, but my feeling is this probably is objectively a draw. Instead of that, Duda played king g7. I was slightly surprised by that, because rook f3, a very, very obvious move, more or less forces him to give up 2 pieces for a rook. Rook g3 mate is a very, well, not mate, but I mean effectively mate, is a very strong threat. So black plays rook g8, and now after rook f4, the knight cannot really go anywhere, because you cannot allow rook takes f7, of course. So by force we get this position. But this position turns out to be nowhere near as bad as I would have thought originally. White has an outside passer on the a file, an outside passer on the h file, and 2 pieces for the rook. But these positions with 2 pieces for the rook, in particular when the knight does not really have a nice, stable place anywhere on the board, they are a lot trickier than they would appear originally. And I think, for instance, the next move that Magnus made, rook f2, might already be a very significant mistake, because I think logically black should be favoring the idea of trading a pair of rooks here. And after rook d2 takes, let's say bishop b3 and king g6, play can continue something along the lines of knight b5. Obviously, we cannot start pushing the a-pawn just yet, because after, let's say, a4, I don't know, some move. I'm kind of struggling for a move right now, but we just need to recreate the threat of rook d3. And with 2 light pieces kind of hanging in the air, it just doesn't feel like white has enough control here. So the machine first reestablishes the knight on c4. And we get to a position something like that. And it turns out that it is very, very difficult to push here. Because once again, once you play a4, black starts harassing your light pieces. If the king leaves the king side very far, for instance, let's say king e2 check, king d1 check, knight d2, and here the machine makes a very cute little move, rook d7, just switching to attacking the h-pawn. And if you play h4, black probably gets enough counterplay attacking the pawn on g3, and if you play knight f1, black starts pushing the e-pawn, aiming for e4, king e5, sorry, I'm losing my voice here. And in a position like this, the evaluation I've seen on my screen, which is, I actually have a glass of water here, I don't know why I'm not using it, which is around 0.90, I think should imply that this is a draw. Not equal, nobody calls this equal, but a draw eventually. So rook b4, a move that Duda chose instead, I think is a questionable decision, but an understandable one, because you are not committing to a type of an endgame by trading the rooks off, and having a pair of rooks to deal with the outside passer feels safer, but I think it's not the correct decision. But here Magnus made a mistake which probably should have cost him half a point here. Not that his win is easy after something like bishop b3, and the machine makes a lot of very uncomfortable looking moves. For instance, here it goes rook c2, c4, bishop a4. I don't think there's very many people who can play like this. And after rook db8, once again, we are avoiding the rook trade by doing this. And honestly, I am not sure if white is winning this, because white is kind of all bunched together. And yes, black cannot really attack this setup, but how are we making much progress here with white is also unclear. But bishop b5 just allows immediate, very strong counterplay. Rook a8, rook is aiming for the a3 square, a4, and now c6, very important move. Obviously you cannot take. So the bishop goes back to e2. And here, I believe Duda missed what amounts to more or less an immediate draw. He should have played rook b3, rook f3, and in this position it's very important not to go rook a5, c5, which looks kind of natural, but you play rook a3, you keep the rook behind the passed pawn, and then you go for rook b8, b3 counterplay. And in many cases the machine would just give up the pawn on a4 and just like wait for black to land the rook on b3 and then just give up on a4 and play without it. But I think if white loses the a4 pawn, draw just becomes an overwhelming favorite. And if you try to stick to it by playing bishop d1 here, black gives a check, and his rooks are incredibly active. You can play knight e2 here, but you take, black takes on f3. You can't even take with the king because rook d2 wins a piece with the rook d3 following. So you take with the g pawn, rook d2, king e1, and once again the same motif. You go rook d8. a5 is more or less never possible because of rook a8. And black is intending to play rook h8. And you can play something like knight g3. I don't know, the machine doesn't go rook h8 here, it goes king f6 first. I don't think it matters a great deal, because I think if you push h4, h5, the pawn will become a target there more than an asset. And some position like this, the light pieces are just so very passive that I think black should hold this. And once again, have no proof of this. This is not an evaluation which reaches 0-0-0. But it gets pretty damn close, as some people in chat would say. And yeah, I think rook b3 with the specific idea of rook a3 is the closest black gets to a draw until round move 42, where Magnus commits another inaccuracy. Instead, Duda played rook a5, rook f3 and f5. This is still sort of fine, but this now depends on black simply not allowing anything and holding a kind of a defensive pattern. King f2, rook c5, bishop d1. And here, the move Duda made is a mistake, because you generally just shouldn't weaken your pawn structure. And also rook b2 check. He played e5. Rook b2 check is just a good idea to further activate your rook. And here, black makes some kind of a somewhat opaque waiting move like rook e5. And once again, I can't prove this is a draw, but the moves the machine is suggesting, for instance, rook f2, rook b4, rook e2, and here, at the best possible moment, we actually do trade and start pushing our stuff. It would appear to me that this is quite possibly holding for black because of just how difficult it is to make any progress here. But e5 is a mistake because of specifically what Magnus immediately does, because he catches these small details very well. He instantly plays knight e2, king f6, and rook a3. And this maneuver would not have been possible because white would not have won a tempo attacking the pawn on f5. Rook b1, king e1, and this is also an incredibly sturdy setup because you can more or less never play rook d5 because of knight c3, and also later in these variations there will be a similar position where white can more or less safely abandon the pawn on a4, because once again black can never take it despite the pin, because knight c3 will fork the rooks on b1 and a4. Black played e4. And here I think I'm reasonably certain h4 wins. But this is not an easy move to make at all. It looks a bit weird. But the point is, you just start pushing it. And it's very difficult for black to reorganize his pieces to actually fight against this very simplistic looking plan. For instance, let's say rook a5, we go h5. The threat is to play rook g3. And as I mentioned, it looks risky to give up the pawn on a4, but you're not actually giving it up because of knight c3 ideas. And if king g5, rook g3 check wins anyway, because you cannot take, there's a discovered check that wins the rook. And after rook b2, h5, rook d5, h6, once again, black has extended sort of to the fullest and still is completely unable to create a single threat, and white eventually will start breaking through. But Magnus made a waiting move here. He played g3, king e5, h4, rook a5, h5, c5, and now the win is a lot less clear. For instance, what people were saying in chat, I think Sese was also very much in favor of this maneuver and considered Magnus's move a large mistake. Knight c3 here, rook b6, and this move rook a3, a2, sort of hinting at rook h2, but in particular preparing and hinting at playing g3, g4, which is slightly weird, but it basically thinks that g4, f4, g5 is just completely winning for white, because those two pawns actually mean something, and the pawns on e4 and f4 white controls without any effort. But the position after, let's say, rook a8, g4, fg4, rook e2, this is the point of rook 8, so we are not going after this pawn, we're going after this one first. Let's say king d4, check, king e5, bishop c2, rook h8, and here it actually collects these two and gives up on h5. And Generally speaking, I guess White should be happy that he destroyed the black center and clarified the situation very, very well. But honestly, with the pawn on c5 still alive and the king quite active in the center and the white piece is nowhere near as active as you will see later in the game, I am not at all convinced that this is winning for White. I think it might not be, to be honest. Magnus played king d2 instead, c4, king c2, rook b8, king c3, and this maneuver is just a mistake. I'm sure Magnus was also by this point somewhat confused by what was happening and not really sure what he should be aiming for. But this particular king c2, king c3 two-step allows what is basically a forced draw. I think the clearest one Duda had in this game. He could have played rook d5, bishop c2, rook d8, and it turns out that counterplay connected with rook d2 and then rook f2, for instance a5, rook d2, knight f4 and rook f2, is just way too strong because there's really no way to stop rook f3 check properly. And black is in time here. You cannot really allow this. Not even just the rook trade, but the fact is that after rook f3, black will also give a check from the b file wherever the king goes. So it's actually very tricky for white. And a possible line is something like rook a1, check, king b4, we just take on g3, knight g6, king f6, a6, and the rook goes back to g2. And even if black has to give up the d8 rook for, let's say, the bishop on c2, black just never loses with his pawns as advanced as this. So had Duda found rook d5, bishop c2, rook b d8, I think he would have actually made a draw because play just becomes incredibly forced and you can very easily intuitively understand what black is aiming for. This maneuver is quite logical. But instead he played rook b1, king c2, rook b8, and of course Magnus doesn't repeat anymore. King c1, rook b6, bishop c2, rook d6, and here Magnus finally finds a restructuring he likes. He goes knight f4, rook c5 and rook e3, aiming for maybe rook e1, h1 as you will see in the game, and also in many positions the g3, g4 break becomes very interesting for white. But I think black still holds here, but he needed very, very good awareness. He should have played rook c8 here, and the point is, the one big plan white has here is rook e1, aiming to put the rook behind. And here you can play rook g8, and to my absolute amazement, the machine says if you give a check from g6, black can take, and the pawn on g3 is hanging, and after rook g1 you just go king d4. And stunningly, black is so active here, and the bishop on c2 so completely dead, that the evaluation on my screen was just 0, 0, 0 here. It's not that easy to believe because white, after all, is a piece up for one pawn in an endgame where black doesn't even have direct threats because f4 will be met by rook d1 check and then g takes f4. But all I can say is this is what the machine says, and the machine is very rarely completely wrong about things like this. But once you don't do this, and Duda did not probably even consider this very seriously, you are in a lot of trouble. He played king d4. Here Magnus missed a bit of an opportunity. He should have played rook e2. And the point is, after rook h6, which is what Duda played after rook e1, you can give this check, and black cannot go forward because after bishop d1 there's actually no way to stop knight g2 mate next move. So rook e2 probably just wins here for that very, very simple reason. You want to play rook h2, but you also want to play g3, g4, and there's absolutely nothing black can do about it. After rook e1, Duda played rook h6, and once again, best move according to the machine here is rook e2, recreating the same threat, waiting for black to play c3, and now, and only now, when after fg rook takes e4 is a mate, because we've taken away the c3 square from the king, g4 just wins by force in this position. But the move that Magnus made is not a mistake. He just played king d2, a very normal human-looking move. Rook e5, knight e2 check, king c5, rook h1, and finally white is making tremendous progress because his pieces are going to good squares. Rook e8, king c3, rook g8, hoping to stop knight f4 from even happening, and Magnus replies by rook b1, which is A very cute tactic, but not a very difficult one. It is also by far the best move in the position. Rook takes h5, bishop takes e4, using obviously the fact that the bishop cannot be taken because of rook b5 check. Bishop e8, knight f4, rook g5, and now we finally give a check, take on g5. And a very important move in this position, because at the time when we were doing live commentary here, we assumed that this is just winning for white. But the computer suggests that this particular position after rook e5, white cannot keep the rooks on the board. If you play rook b6 check and rook f6, I think the rooks still come off after rook f3. And to our, frankly, huge disbelief, the position with the rooks coming off very often will be a draw, despite white having two pieces in the a-pawn against the rook. I briefly checked the table bases when preparing this video, and they're not all drawn. Some of them, even with the king reasonably close to the pawn, are still lost. But I think kind of a general rule of thumb is, if you can keep the king very far away from the pawn, let's say if you can get, and I will just make some moves which don't make any sense just to illustrate my point. Obviously you take on f5 here, but what I mean is, in some kind of a position like this, if you can get the bishop to d5 so that the king never actually reaches the a5 squares and even the b6 square, you're probably winning. Once again, if table base says this is a draw, I will look very silly. But this is what I understood from clicking around. Now, this is winning, or at least with the bishop on d5 it should be winning. And with the king on b6, if black doesn't make a horrible obvious mistake and plays king b6 here, this is likely a draw. Once again, maybe this particular one is lost because king b4 looks very strong, there are no checks. But the general rule of thumb, as I understood it, is in this material balance, if the king actually manages to get near to the pawn, black probably saves the game. Therefore, Magnus's choice to play king d4 here is very, very good, not allowing rook e5 at all. And also it was practically very strong because Duda had very, very limited time available here. And his next move just more or less loses on the spot. He should have played rook a8 here. And after something like a5, rook a3, knight d5, creating a threat of mate in 1, black goes rook b3, rook c5, c3, knight e3. All of this looks actually very, very obscure and difficult to understand, but the conclusion seems to be that black cannot force white to trade rooks here. And the pawn on c3 will eventually fall without white ever actually trading rooks. And then white, I suppose, must be winning, although once again, there have been some mutterings that even these positions sometimes are drawn. We don't know whether to trust them or not because Sese kind of disagrees, but we've had people suggest to us that on machines even more bulky and ultra server-like than Sese, these positions, even with rooks on, might be holdable. Sounds unlikely, but you cannot always figure out if people telling you things in chat are just making it up as they go along or if they know something. Instead, Duda played rook g1, and now white just drives the king very, very far away from action. Rook b6 check, you cannot go in this direction because you get mated in 2. The king goes to e7, and then Magnus just gave this check, then this one, and then simply took on c4 with the knight. And this, I think, is quite intuitively understood that this is completely lost for black because the king is just too far away from where it should be. Rook a8, a5, rook a1, rook b5, rook a7. And here Magnus committed a weird inaccuracy because obviously you want the king as close to the pawn as possible. And it's possible to play king c5 immediately because you can actually play king b6 here using the fact that you have this very simple tactic. And I think king c5 is something like mate in 24 according to Sese. But the move bishop e4, which Magnus played instead, is still really not spoiling anything. Rook c7. Here he spent quite a lot of time checking what's what, because obviously there is an option of playing rook b8 and rook b7, trading the last pair of rooks off, but the king will get very close to the pawn actually. And eventually Magnus, I think, wisely decided not to do that because, once again, I did not check properly, but I think Sese says that after the rook trade, it is somewhat surprisingly, just an immediate draw. He played rook f5 instead, just not allowing the king to reach the f-file for now, just cutting it off. King g7, bishop c2, rook c1, king c3. Once again, we are giving up two pieces for the rook, but obviously with the king cut off along the f-file, this is unfeasible for black. You will never be in time here. But Duda made a move which kind of loses on the spot, but I guess by this point he was very tired of defending this horrible position. He played rook f7, which just isn't analogous to resigning, but the move that people were suggesting is by far the best here. Rook e7 should still lose to rook b5, followed by simply a6, rook b6 eventually. And white will at some point start making progress. I really can't believe this is not winning for white. But after rook f7, Magnus did not take very long to just take. You can't obviously play a6 yet, but you can play knight a3, a move which is sort of both cute and not very difficult at all, because it completely locks down the a-file. The knight can be attacked, but then white just improves his position further. And even more importantly, the king is just not in the square, so you cannot run with the king. You have to try stopping the pawn with the rook, and then white will play a6, a7, knight b5, bishop b4, and just win the rook for the a5 pawn. And obviously you are not going to check whether the world champion knows how to mate with bishop and knight against king. So this is Magnus's victory over Jan-Krzysztof Duda in round 12. Now I think it's time to briefly discuss what happened in the round apart from that, and the situation before the next round. Jan Nepomniachtchi, who was playing black against Sam Shankland, and who was half a point behind the leaders, I guess as a combination of his tournament situation and also keeping in mind what happened to Shankland in round 11, he played sort of very sharply and very non-standardly in appearance against Shankland today with black, and was more or less lost by move 16. His opening experiment just horribly backfired today, and he is now out of contention. Anish Giri played with black against Timur Rajabov, who came to play, and that was a very, very sharp game, throughout which basically Anish was under tremendous pressure. And he escaped once again by a weird confluence of factors, but mainly because Timur just didn't believe he was much better and or even safe in the final position. And he offered a draw where the machine still suggests much of his advantage remains. So a bit of a lucky break for Anish there. Although I have to say that the final position, it's a lot easier to understand that Rajabov is better if you have the machine running. So you can't really blame him too much. So with those three results, the tournament standings look as follows. This is the situation at the top. Magnus is on 8.5 out of 12. Giri is his only real rival on 8 out of 12. Both of those results are stunningly good, frankly, in a tournament of this strength. And Jan, with his today's loss, and Ding and Anand, who drew their game, are now not in touch with the first two places anymore. And the pairings for round 13 are as follows. Apologies for that. Let me correct that. These are the pairings. Giri plays with the white pieces against Carlsen. So because Carlsen won today and Giri didn't, the situation is very, very clear. There will never be any tie breaks. If Giri wins, he is the champion. If he doesn't win, Magnus wins the tournament. And then there is the rest of the tournament. Plenty of things to talk about there, but only one game matters in terms of the tournament winner. Nepomniachtchi plays white against Rajabov, Kramnik white against Shankland. You can see all these things on your screen, including the game that wasn't on the screen at first, Duda against Ding Liren. Plenty to talk about normally, but really only the Giri Carlsen game matters, and it will be the game that we'll be paying the most attention to tomorrow. So I hope you join us for the live broadcast tomorrow from the last round of Tata Steel 2019. It starts an hour and a half earlier than all the previous rounds, 12 Central European time. So do tune in if you can. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.